Chapter 44. Aisha. 9 years ago, when Aisha had become a thief, she had made a promise to her king. I will not run. As a child, she had fled from danger. She had run through burning fields as her family was slaughtered and her village was destroyed. Then the jinn had found her, and they had carved a mark into her skin for every family member who died trying to save her. So Aisha had promised never to run again. She had vowed to become powerful enough to face her adversaries head on so that they no longer had the ability to drag her back screaming. 9 years later, she had broken her promise. The halls were a blur as she ran through the ruins, the world tilted and off kilter as she struggled to see through one eye. She sprinted clumsily through the halls, the prince's sword in her hands, and she thought, I do not want to die. Imad had said she was replaceable. She'd always thought herself above such fears, but he was right. Though she had been chosen by him, Omar would never risk his life for her. She collapsed against the wall when she was sure her assailant's footsteps had faded, using the moment of reprieve to gather herself and catch her breath. She needed to find the prince. The prince who had, with some strange magic, saved her. Aisha lowered herself into a crouch and glanced around the corner. She tried to ignore the throbbing pain behind her. It was useless now. She only hoped it wasn't infected. She heard the soft thud of footsteps behind her and whirled, heart beating in her throat as she searched the periphery for Ahmed's men. Aisha, a voice whispered from the ether, and then Prince Mazen appeared out of thin air. Or rather, his face did. Aisha stared, flabbergasted, at his floating head. It's me, the prince said. He sounded out of breath, as if he'd just sprinted through the corridor. Mazen. She remembered the magic Imad had used to appear in Omar's body. She raised her sword. Prove it. In time, I said you were confusing two professions. What were they? For a moment, the prince just stared at her. Then he inhaled sharply and said, I remember. You told me you were meant to be my bodyguard, not my nursemaid. Aisha suppressed a sigh of relief as she rose slowly from her crouch and approached him. She studied the magic he was wearing. It seemed to be a cloak. When she looked closely, she could make out the fuzzy outline of his body. So that's how you snuck into the chamber. What kind of twisted magic is this? The useful kind, he laughed weakly. At least it's useful when you're not being chased by magic-smelling ghouls. He cast a nervous look over his shoulder. Seemingly satisfied that he was no longer being pursued by undead creatures, he peeled the magic off him, revealing both his previously invisible body and the cloak that had made it so. He dropped the fabric to the floor. Aisha watched in awe as it stretched into his shadow. I think it's from the shadow jinn. A realization snapped into place. Omar had confided in her that he hadn't been able to find the shadow jinn's relic after defeating it in the Sultan's Diwan. Now Aisha knew why. She snorted. It's a magic that suits you. The prince frowned. Because I am a coward? She paused, remembering she'd called him that in the Wanderer's Sanctuary. That he would bring up such a flippant barb now, when they were in such peril, made her laugh. That's one way of putting it. It's footsteps. 2 pairs, coming from around the corner. Aisha moved on instinct, pressing herself against the wall and drawing her sword. Her grip on the foreign blade was awkward, but it would suffice. She was not sentimental about her weapons. All that mattered, all that had ever mattered, was that they could cut. She pressed a finger to her lips as the prince hurriedly threw his shadow over his head and vanished. Soon the footsteps were right beside her. Aisha lunged. The men reacted too slowly. She looped her arms around one's neck, pressed the edge of her blade into his throat, and glared over his shoulder at his companion. One more step and I'll cut his throat. The second man was undeterred. He rushed her with his blade. But the assault never came. One moment he was running toward her. The next he was struggling in place with his sword arm bent awkwardly behind him. Aisha couldn't see the prince, but she could hear his quavering voice coming from behind the captured man. Tell us where the merchant is. The assailant beneath Aisha's blade shuddered. In our treasure chamber. Aisha hesitated. A trap? The prince's prisoner shifted, and then he broke free, wrenching away Mazen's invisible hand and throwing himself against the wall. The prince gasped. The man Aisha had captured threw her off in the same moment, nearly knocking the blade from her hand. Aisha staggered. She just barely managed to duck an incoming strike from her assailant as she rushed to the other man. The prince's shadow had fallen from his shoulders, and Aisha saw him crushed against the wall, hands uselessly outstretched to shield himself from his attacker, who was raising his blade. Aisha stabbed him in the lungs before he could bring it down. Prince Mazen made a choked sound of distress as the dying man collapsed in front of him. The still living man came at them with a roar. Aisha reached for her sword, but it was stuck fast in her victim's shoulder. Thankfully, the prince was faster. He grabbed the corpse's sword off the ground and swept it through the air. The motion was clumsy, panicked, but it still landed. The sword lodged itself into the villain's shoulder. The man screamed. Prince Mazen screamed. Aisha experienced a moment of startling clarity. She slid behind the prince as the killer pulled the sword out of his shoulder with a grunt. Mazen stumbled back, gripping the now bloody blade with shaking hands. Aisha was ready for him. No sooner had he fallen into her than she wrapped her arms around him from behind and grasped his hands over the sword hilt. The prince stiffened. Aisha marveled at the softness of his hands in her calloused ones. She could feel his frenzied, fragile heartbeat beneath her fingers. She pushed the observations away and focused on gliding the blade. Their opponent was still staggering from the first wound, so when she and Mazen plunged the sword into his chest, he did not retaliate. He groaned, bled, and slowly he died. Mazen's hands were shaking so badly, Aisha could barely keep the hold of them. The moment she peeled herself away, he keeled over like a puppet with cut strings. Prince, she stepped forward. He abruptly straightened. He looked unbalanced, like a passenger on a ship trying to acclimate themselves to the turbulent sway of the ocean. I'm okay. Aisha frowned. You've killed ghouls before, haven't you? The prince breathed in deeply. Yes, he said through clenched teeth. She looked at him for a long moment before she handed back the sword. Then come on, let's find this treasure chamber. She reached down to pluck the sword off the fresh corpse, then strode on ahead. The prince followed. They passed through the more ruined corridors, saw more dusty wall paintings. Aisha was unaccustomed to filling silences, but she tried to comfort the clearly unhinged prince by musing aloud her opinion that the ruins had once belonged to Jinn. She hoped the speculation would distract him, maybe even coax him into telling one of those stories he was so obsessed with, but Prince Mazen didn't respond. He was staring at his hands, at the red smeared on them. Prince? Mazen didn't respond. His eyes were foggy, unfocused. Aisha thought again of his frantic heartbeat, his uncalloused hands. The man before her was not a warrior. He was a pacifist, and in protecting him she had potentially broken him. She set a hand on his shoulder. The prince startled and looked up. You lied to me, she frowned. You're not okay. No, the prince said. No, I'm not. He took a deep breath. I just killed a man. Looking at his crumpled, teary expression, it occurred to Aisha she had stopped mourning her victims long ago. A small, muted pang ran through her chest. If it makes you feel any better, I was the one who swung the sword. Mazen laughed softly, dejectedly. Right, because I am an incompetent coward. Coward. There was that word again, the one she had hurled at him in the tavern. Evidently, it had done more damage than she had anticipated. She had not realized it was possible for the son of a politician to be so sensitive. But then, long ago, she had lived her life without armor too. We all start as cowards. Mazen's expression fell. Aisha set a hand on his cheek before he could turn away, guiding his gaze back to hers. We are all afraid, Prince. The only difference between a hero and a coward is that one forgets their fear and fights, while the other succumbs to it and flees. Something released in her at the words, though she couldn't say what it was. Your fear of death does not make you weak, only human. The prince, for once, was completely quiet. He stared at her with wide eyes. Aisha released his shoulder with a sigh. He was the one on the verge of tears, so why did she suddenly feel so vulnerable? I should not have made that word into a weapon, she mumbled. I was wrong about you. If you were truly a coward, you'd have left me and fled. The prince swallowed. His eyes were glassy. You can cry all you like after this is over, but right now, I need you. The prince managed a weak nod. Aisha turned and continued down the corridor. She was relieved to be able to turn away from this conversation, except there was still one thing she needed to say. A word that had been on the tip of her tongue since he'd rescued her. Prince? Yes? Shukran. It was only a single word, but it eased her heart. She angled her head slightly enough to catch the prince's returning smile. Afwan. It was barely a conversation at all, and yet it somehow felt like the first time they'd spoken. Not as a thief and a prince, but as Aisha and Mazen. Perhaps that was why their conversation flowed easier afterward, and why they returned to their wandering and the prince asked her about Ahmed's grudge against Omar. She answered him truthfully. She confirmed that Imad had been one of the Sultan's 40 thieves, and that, after Shafia had died and the title of king was bequeathed to Omar, Imad had worked for the prince, but their camaraderie had been brief. Omar's first and last order for the Sultan's thieves was to capture a priceless relic. She hesitated, knowing Mazen would not appreciate this next truth. They tracked it down to a Bedouin campsite and cut through the entire tribe to get to it. Prince stared at her in horror. But why? The Jinn King relics are a secret. Omar did not want rumors to spread. Aisha flinched. It sounded like a flimsy excuse even to her own ears. Their efforts were for nothing in the end. They died at the hands of a mysterious jinn, and only Imad survived to tell the tale. He returned to Medine and blamed Omar for his comrades' deaths. Then, because he is a haughty fool, he challenged your brother to a duel and lost. Mazen frowned. So his hands, an injury from the duel. She paused at the bend in the corridor. When she ascertained that what lay on the other side was just another empty hall, she beckoned Mazen to follow. The Sultan punished Imad for his insult by banishing him, she continued, and Omar had no choice but to start again. This part of the story she knew well, for it was when she had entered the narrative. He chose 40 of us by his own hand, and we have served him since. She paused, her gaze falling on a series of intricate diamond patterns that unspooled across the wall's cracked surface like golden thread. I was there when Omar and Imad fought, she said. Your brother and I ran into each other on Medine's streets. He recruited me before Imad returned. How did you two meet? I tried to pick his pockets. When he simply stared at her, she shrugged and said, he saw potential in me. Anyway, that's why I witnessed Imad's defeat. That's why he hates me. I think he hates everyone, he murmured. Aisha remembered Imad storming toward Omar in the courtyard 9 years ago. She remembered the way he had glared at her. You've replaced us with a woman, a girl. You, you have tied your own noose. Aisha shook the memory from her head with a scowl. Yes, he is a miserable creature. There was a momentary silence, and then, so Imad has a Jinn King's relic now? Aisha frowned. She expected Imad to possess the cursed collar. Instead, he'd taken out the merchant's much less impressive compass. She assumed he meant to use it to track down Omar, a rather underwhelming use for a so-called powerful relic. I doubt it. I thought he was going to pull out that relic from the dune, but either he doesn't know of its power or the merchant lost it somewhere. They had just turned a corner when she heard it, a scream so shrill it pierced her eardrums. For a few moments, Aisha was too shaken to reach for her blade. The prince stepped forward during her moment of hesitation. He started walking, faster and faster, until he was running. Prince, she chased after him. What are you doing? But the prince had apparently lost all sense of reason and was darting mindlessly toward the chamber where the scream had come from. The treasure chamber, no doubt. It was a trap, it had to be, and the stupid prince was heading right into it. Aisha gave chase. The world swam before her eye as she ran, but she ignored her exhaustion. Prince Mazen had saved her life, and she was hell-bent on repaying the favor. Aisha did not mourn the past, and she did not overthink the future. But the present, that was something she could shape for the better with her blade, and she would not run from it.